Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi and I have with me my colleague Pranay. And in the context of the upcoming visit of the Indian Prime Minister to the US in June, which will be the first state visit of an Indian PM to the US since 2009, we were just thinking to discuss the broader US-India partnership and what it means, how it has evolved, and we'll also talk about a certain form of skepticism which is being shown by the US commentators and then how Indian commentators are trying to respond to it. So very warm welcome, Pranay.
Hey, hi Saurabh. Yeah, indeed, India-US relations is probably the most important relationship for India definitely over the next few years, and it's good that over the last few days there has been some healthy debate on this. So let's discuss that. I think the first article which sort of put the cat amongst the pigeons was Ashley Tellis' article in the Foreign Affairs, which was provocatively titled America's Bad Bet on India. And obviously the article titles are decided by people who publish it. But I think the point that Ashley Tellis makes is really important. First of all, Ashley Tellis is one of the key figures of the 2005 civil nuclear deal, is a well-known realist scholar, and he's always been a strong proponent of India-US relations. So it's all the more important when he says something which puts some skepticism in India-US relations, right? So that's the background. So I'll just summarize the article. I think the main point was put in the last sentence, which I'll just read out. What he says is that the US should certainly help India to the degree compatible with American interests, but it should not harbor any illusions that this support, no matter how generous, will entice India to join it in any military coalition against China. The relationship with India is fundamentally unlike those that the US enjoys with its allies, and the Biden administration should recognize this reality rather than try to alter it. So I think that was the main point. So what do you think about this, Saurabh?
I mean, I can understand the broader argument in the sense that I think it's very prudent that people in the US don't think that India would join an alliance with the US against China. But I am also not sure how many people are actually even trying to think that. I think if you see the statements by senior US officials, including Kurt Campbell, said very recently that they don't think of India as like an ally as US has like in Australia, in Japan, and Korea. So India is not a treaty ally. So I don't think the US establishment, at least the ones in the government, are thinking of India in a way that will be an actual ally in against China, especially in the context of Taiwan. So I'm not sure where this is coming from, although it could be the case that maybe the US Congress and then the broader community may feel that, this kind of approach is a stepping stone towards a more concrete commitment. And if that is the case, then I think this article is helpful. That I don't think that, India would be very happy with a clear-cut alliance with US against China.
Yeah, so I think the fundamental argument that Tellis is making, I think both of us are sort of agreeing with that, in the sense that, yes, I mean, it's unlikely that the Indian government is going to engage in South China Sea. Now, it's a different argument about what we think. So I think India should do a lot more in that region. Maybe you don't. I know we've had this discussion before. But nevertheless, I think the point that he's making is not about what should be. But the point is that realistically, Indian government at this point doesn't seem to have indicated that it will do anything in the South China Sea or East Asia broadly related to, say, a joint naval op, etc., if the situation were to escalate. So I think that's a fair point. And like you said, first of all, US, like the Indian system, is an open system, and there are many stakeholders who have a voice, and they raise their voice in the open domain, right, like we do. So I'm sure there would be people within the US administration and Congress who would be thinking that, hey, we are doing so much for India now, at least in their perception, we are being quote unquote generous to India. And what is India giving us in return, right? So I'm sure there would be players. So I guess the article is addressing those points. And it's an article that is setting expectations. And to that extent that it is setting expectations, I think I agree with that fundamental argument, that first of all, expectation setting is important. And I do agree that India is unlikely to behave like a weaker ally now. And the US India relationship will definitely have some shades that the US China relationship had until 2004-5, right? So there were some competition, there was not a full agreement. There were things which happened which sort of meant that there was serious strain on the relationship, but broadly it still continued and grew on many fronts, right? So some shades of that will definitely be there here, unlike, let's say, a US Japan relationship, yeah, where it is clear which is the more powerful side, which is the less powerful side. It is also clear that there was post World War angle dominates that relationship, whereas that perspective isn't there in the India US relationship. So I think broadly I do agree in the long term that if there were something to happen in Taiwan, or if there is a sudden change, as you said, I mean, currently the administrations on both sides have shown remarkable understanding, even on Ukraine, but that's not a guarantee, right? Like, it has happened today, but situation might change in the future, and so it's important to take Tellis's warning with some seriousness instead of defending that, yeah, Indian US relationship has no problems whatsoever. So I think that is what I would stand at.
But I was wondering, I mean, what do you think of this, the argument that, US has practiced or is practicing this strategic altruism, like regarding India? Because I'm not sure, I mean, each country, I mean, more or less works for its interest, and it has been and is in US interest to build, like, to strengthen India, because obviously being the India size, being China's neighbor and having the capacity, I mean, US would like India to be on its side, at the same way that India would like to have US on its side as well. So I'm not sure how much, I buy into this idea that, US is being generous. I mean, both sides are doing what they can to support. I mean, US is the stronger party in many respects, but I am not even sure there are many other countries like India, like US can ally with, or at least be a strong partner. So do you buy this argument that US has been altruistic towards India?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, using terms like altruism, etc., in a backdrop where Matsya Nyaya operates, right? International relations are obviously about power. So yeah, I mean, generosity sort of doesn't fit into this. But I would actually agree with the fundamental argument that over the next few years, that it's no doubt that US relationship will be more asymmetric towards giving India some things rather than India being able to give some, right? I mean, that's how power operates. So you can call it altruism, you can call it asymmetry, but that's the truth, that the US will probably have to give a lot more than to take back, right? I mean, what can India do? Yeah, India can promise some things on the Indian Ocean, also a lot of things on the international agencies and fora, but in terms of concrete, transfer of technology, etc., it will have to be on the US side. And remember, this article is probably addressed to the US side, right? So it has to take their concerns into account rather than whether this is altruism or this is asymmetry. So I do believe there is some form of asymmetry there, and yes, US will be investing a lot more. It has to invest a lot more if it wants India on board, and from that sense I agree with that point.
Okay. And so this article obviously did generate a lot of commotion and debate on Twitter, as almost everything does nowadays. So we have this kind of like a rejoinder by Ashok Malik, who is a former advisor to MEA. So talk about that. I mean, he seems to disagree with the analysis of Tellis, and saying that, there seems to be a disconnect between what the governments of both India and US are doing and they are saying, and what commentators are saying.
Yeah, so that article was also quite nice. And I think coming back to your previous question, and what Ashok Malik is also saying is something similar, that his point is you shouldn't be fixating on a hypothetical war on Taiwan and India's position. First of all, that war is hypothetical, and what India will do will depend on that exact circumstance. So his point is that is a bad metric to judge what India and US are accomplishing or can do in reality, right? So and that's what addresses your previous question also, right? That I don't think it's a point about generosity or not, but whether the final strategic aim is testing whether India will do something with respect to a military thing in East Asia and South China Sea. I mean, obviously that's not the only strategic goal US has, right? I mean, can be so many other things with respect to China itself. So that is one point. So that's sort of a argument that it's a wrong question to ask. And like you said, the argument that Ashok Malik is making, that it is actually an imagined roadblock that even the Biden administration isn't overly concerned about. And then he goes on to list the several domains in which India and US have done a lot of things, and they have worked out some modus vivendi, despite the fact that they have key differences on many issues, right? Still there are things that India-US relationship are going forward on, right? So that is the argument, and I agree with his view as well. Actually, there's no doubt that India-US relationship has grown across sectors, and you and I, Saurabh, itself have been part of meetings where we've seen how the India-US conversations have shifted, right? At the execution levels, the talks are no longer about whys but about the hows, right? So earlier we used to just have conversations which used to start with Pakistan, end with India's closeness with Russia, and in between just people taking spats at each other with no concrete things, right? So it was just about why should we do something, etc. But now the conversations have really shifted. They literally, people are talking about the hows, asking about recommendations, that what is realistically things that India and US can do on space, biotech, semiconductors, defense. So the conversation is about what exactly should we do, not about whether we should do something or not. So that clearly is a shift. So sort of I agree with this view as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also a bit kind of, I mean, this point has been said before, but if you see, like, in last 25 years, I mean, there have been governments in US and India of all ideologies, parties and everything, and this relationship seems to be only going up and up, in the sense that, I mean, so in a way, I think the congruence, would you say it is very structural? Like, it is not as much, because, like, there are times where I think we get stuck with, which party is in power, the ideologies, domestic issues here and there. So there may be problems a bit here and there. But would you say that structurally, the India-US partnership is something that, does benefit both, and it is not going to really change much, except the fact that, how much or how intensely do we, like, cooperate? Like, for example, during, like, we had Quad rival. So do you see, like, structurally, we, like, both are poised to stay together?
Yeah, I think, see, if you believe in structural realism as a overarching sort of basis for international relations, then yes, broadly there is congruence. China is not going anytime soon as a threat. So as long as that is a glue, I think India and US will work out ways to operate together. But I also agree that, the gains that each side can achieve is not 100% guaranteed just because of structural congruence. So the amount of things that India gets out of this relationship and the amount of things US gets out of this relationship will still vary. So it depends on what our goal is with this relationship. For example, if India's goal is that, we need to quickly build our national power, and for that we need, say, transfer of technologies, we need very close research collaborations between India and US in strategic areas, then those are our asks. Then obviously we'll have to do a lot more if some of those things we want. Similarly, on the US side, if US wants something from the Indian side, then probably US also has to remove its stubbornness on, say, of not giving preferential market access to India. Currently, they are not even conversing on a free trade agreement with India, right? So these things are real trade-offs. So yeah, I mean, India and US will be together, but it depends, right? You can be together 10 feet apart, or you can be together 1 feet apart. So it depends on that. So broadly, what I think, actually, the two views that we talked about, they are not mutually exclusive. I think they both hold together. There's no doubt that India-US relationship has gone ahead, and the way I see it in economic terms is there's something called the production possibility frontier, which says what is the maximum limit of goods, products, ideas that can be produced given a budget constraint. Okay, so broadly what it means is that what are the product possibility that this relationship can achieve. If we are looking at that frontier, we are so far behind that frontier that there is actually many low hanging fruits to pick, and that's what is happening now, right? So all the things that we are seeing, I mean, jet engines, that's, this conversation has been going on for, I don't know, donkey's years. I even forgot when it started. So again, those things have been reiterated. So the good thing is now there's a framework, probably there's a lot more energy to it. So there are enough things to do before this concern which Tellis raises becomes a binding issue, becomes a binding constraint. So that's what we are seeing. But also we should realize that if let's say US president were to change, if the Indian government were to change after the elections, or if there is actually an escalation around Taiwan, then the relationship might hit a ceiling that Tellis warns about. So that's why I think sort of agree with both views. Right now, we can do a lot of things, but the barrier that Tellis talks about is also real, and we should not lose sight of it.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
I mean, actually, do agree with you, but I was also thinking that, if we are thinking of hypotheticals, and so let's say one more hypothetical, if there is a conflict along the LAC, would US come to rescue India? I mean, I'm also not sure if India wants to be rescued by US, but the idea being that if there are questions regarding, how much or what kind of help India would do during Taiwan, I mean, there are different spectrum of what India can do. Same with the also spectrum what US can do in a India China a conflict, and I'm not sure we can be that sure also about what kind of help that US will give. Also, I mean, US has been helping a lot during the current crisis regarding ISR data and everything, but that also are questions, right? Because lawmakers will also ask is that should the US help kinetically or through active involvement in a conflict regarding India and China?
Yeah, like you said in the second half of your comment, there is evidence now that US did offer a lot of things on the intelligence side, etc. And it was the Indian government which didn't want to sort of present it this way for justifiable reasons, right? But so at least at this point, I don't think that is the major issue. But I think, see, finally we have to encounter this trade-off that do we want US more than it wants us? I think that's the trade-off. I think we want US more, to be very blunt about it. But there are people who don't agree with that view. So that is fine. But if we look at it structurally, power-wise, given our capability-wise, and what the EAM himself said, right, that we are way behind China on many things, and we have to accelerate our growth, do a lot of things to catch up, to really confront China on many things. So how do you do that quickly? If that is your strategic main aim, then you would do what it takes to get things from the US or any other country and build that power, right? So if that is the goal, then I don't think this is a concern, right? I mean, will US come and help in Ladakh or Galwan? I mean, at least evidence says that to some extent they did, but to what extent will they go, etc., is again a hypothetical that we shouldn't be concerned about at this stage. If we want to build power, I mean, we should do what it takes to do that.
True. And I mean, also given the asymmetry in capabilities as you talked about, so the spectrum of what can be done in a conflict, that spectrum is quite wide for US in contrast to India. I mean, we can't do as much regarding the conflict on Taiwan as, let's say, the US could do, with our conflict with China along the LAC. So, I mean,
yeah, no, I agree. And actually, I looked at it from a framework point of view. So I had written about this TriAxis framework to look at the India-US relationship. So there are basically three axes on which this relationship operates. One is people to people relations, second one is state to state relations, and third one is state to the people of other country. So these are three. So now look at people to people. I don't think that was ever a problem. So it's only growing. We can just discard that and hopefully wish that it will continue to only strengthen. Now state to state is what Ashok Malik is also addressing, that it has grown, it has turned a corner, and I agree with that, right? It is definitely the kinds of things that are happening now were unimaginable 10 years ago. So yes, state to state relationships have also been. But the binding constraint here is state to people relations, and I think that also feeds into the state to state execution and delivery, because people in India have lot of concerns about US as a strategic actor because of the past. Now we can agree that those don't matter now, the geopolitics has changed, etc., but perceptions are what they are, and there are real perceptions that there are gaps how Indian people see the US state. And similarly, I think US people also see the Indian state and have some doubts over it as a strategic actor. So this is a binding constraint, and that binding constraint also feeds sometimes into to what extent the two states can interact with each other. right? So that's how I see it, and it's only the two administrations that can break this ceiling. Like I said, these trade-offs are real, and it's now up to the administrations how they go forward. And I hope the PM's visit is helpful in removing some of these constraints and going past this old perceptions.
So, what do you kind of see in the argument that Ashok Malik made, that there seems to be some disconnect between the perception of the US-India relationship between the states, I mean the governments and the commentators? Do you see that divergence yet, or if you do, then why do you think that is?
Yeah. No, but I mean, commentators are not a homogeneous unit, right? So there will be a lot of people who will see, and neither is the state, right? So within the governments itself, you will see very differing views. So similarly, there are differing views within the commentators as well. But yeah, if you were to look at the mean of these two views, I agree that the state to state relationship has moved far ahead. Like it has a lot of things are happening which commentariat would have also not imagined a few years ago. So in that sense, yes, but yeah, it's a spectrum, so not everyone is saying the same thing.
So, I mean, and if you see, I mean, this year seems to be like a very active year for the US-India partnership, in the sense that, like both like Modi and Biden will meet, at the G7 summit, then they'll meet at the Quad summit in Australia, then they'll meet in the US when Modi goes for state visit, then hopefully Biden will come to India for G20. So there are so many, different opportunities for them to interact, and then especially when this is at such a high level. So you could see maybe that, some concrete deliverables may also be, because we also see, I'm curious that you see this emerging India-US partnership in the Middle East, or for us, it's West Asia. And you saw the US NSA, the Indian NSA, and UAE leaders met with Saudis for like some West Asian kind of cooperation. Do you see that like India then also trying to move out of its comfort zone and trying to be more active in regions outside with like a more tacit US-India collaboration?
Yeah, that was interesting to see. But yeah, I guess it's too early. I would say that, because the question I always ask is, what is the glue that is holding all these countries together? And I don't think China is that glue in this context in West Asia. I mean, it's not that big a threat. Quad, I agree, is a more powerful element because the threat is more real, more proximate for the Quad. So yeah, I mean, these are new. But what I would say is things that can concretely be done. I think, see, India-US relationship, one big grouse that on the state to people dimension that we're talking about is technology denial, right? So MTCR and the whole old grouses about how the technology was denied to India in space and nuclear fields, and especially the role of US and all that is a big concern. Now, if US and India can turn around on that issue, that is a big thing which will just take away a big pain point. So if there are actually some things on jet engine tech transfer, if there's something really on, say, a fab coming to India of the US. Now I understand that it's a private player, US government doesn't have, but the US government definitely has a lot of controls on transfer of technology for its domestic firms. So it can play an enabling role on that. So if there are some things on these which is India's main strategic concerns, if US can play a role in that, then that whole technology denial narrative just gets punctured. So that's one real concrete area where the two countries can quickly get around. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, there are things on that we can do multilaterally, but it takes time, like, I mean, to get 4 countries aligned on a geography and get things executed will take some time. It's not going to change people's strategic calculations or thinking and perceptions.
Yeah, plus I think we also see that, I mean, there seems to be, like, as you said, like a very good people to people connect between India and US. And many Indians, I mean, they like the US, but there is this like suspicion, how independent will India remain? Like, will strategic autonomy be challenged? And I think if these things happen, as you said, like transfer of technology and stuff, then I think that kind of can offset a very, like a big chunk of negative perception in India, which can then, I think, help move forward.
Agree.
And it, like, I mean, there's also this argument. I mean, it's half funny that like in one of the, I think, reports, I think in The Economist, it said that a former deputy NSA of Japan said that like India would be more like like a very big France, like in terms of its relationship with the US. How do you think I mean, Do you agree with it? Or in the sense, France is a very close ally of the US, but it still retains a lot of its independence, and sometimes it's not very well accepted. So do you see that comparison being decent?
No, I don't think so. First of all, I don't know the details of US-France relationship to sort of draw an exact parallel. But as far as metaphors go, I would say India-US relationship will be more like a much friendlier and democratic China and US relationship.
That's very interesting. That's not heard. Can you expand on that in the sense that people don't see that way? But more I hear from you, I think that's true, because it's like both countries are trying to adjust to each other. Both countries are too big and too independent to become an ally of each other in a very conventional sense. But they do have to figure out a way to stay together.
No, and allyship itself is such a Cold War era and World War term, right? I think we are way past that. Every single country in this world has a lot more agency than that period, right? You can look at the smaller states also, how they behave. None of them is allied with any of their bigger neighbors. So that's a wrong framework to look at itself. Okay. So I don't think that framework applies the Cold War era framework. But the US-China relationship was interesting, right? The glue was Sino-Soviet split, and that started the thing that US-China came together. Of course, because China was authoritarian and communist, there was even more binding constraints to what they could do together. And they didn't have the people-to-people axis like India and US have now, right? So, but India really has a lot more things that going for it on this front, right? So there is a lot more people-to-people relationships. Both countries are democracies. Both countries have a lot more congruence than US-China did. But yet they, just like US-China, when two big countries are interacting, it's very difficult to have some sort of ally treatyship signed, right? So similarly, I don't think India and US will go to that extent. And also because of India projected to be fast growing economy, there are lots of things that it would want to engage other countries with, rather than just say outright that it is an ally. So I think that word itself has no meaning in today's geopolitics, and we shouldn't overly focus on it. As long as both countries are able to get what they want to an extent, that is what matters.
Yeah, true. As you said, there will also be some healthy competition between, let's say, India and US in many things. As India grows, as India becomes more richer, it will also try to have new technologies. We already see, there is some friction on, always on IP, on digital companies and everything. So that competition would also, remain. So as long as that remains, that kind of mutual coexistence, will have to be cultivated.
Yeah, agree.
Okay, well, that's our time today, and there is a lot that hopefully will happen in the next few months as the leaders keep meeting for one summit and the other, and then hopefully we'll see some concrete developments. Maybe we'll have a new podcast when the US agrees to transfer the jet engine technology to India. Hopefully that happens this year. And thanks a lot, Pranay.
Thanks, Saurabh.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.